Hi and welcome back. This is Police Stories Podcast and this is episode 49, a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force. Thanks very much for coming back, or welcome if this is your first time. Really good on the downloads again this week, and a lot more people went to YouTube, which is interesting. It was just a suggestion from me because you can leave comments or ask questions if you'd like to. Right, we'll crack on this week then. So if you remember, I'd just been accepted onto the Marine unit on the River Thames, all about the boats obviously, and I'd completed my training. That was all in the last episode, so now we're going to get on to some actual calls and talk about the role of the Marine Policing Unit, which, as we discussed last week, has a very long history dating way back. So their main role, I guess, is patrolling, obviously. It's about preventing crime. Originally they were set up to prevent the thefts along the river from the various wharves. But it's perhaps not about that so much now, because the cargo that comes into separate areas and wharves and piers that are, much more secure now, and it's all automated. A lot of it, comes in on containers and things. So there isn't the cargo coming up in the same way it did. It's changed obviously over those last few hundred years, as you'd expect. So it's perhaps not so much about the crime, but certainly it's about that visible patrol. All the police boats are very visible. They're well. They have the Battenberg design of sort of police stripes, if you like, on the side. So they're very, very visible. It's one of the few roles you can work on in the police, particularly in this country, where people are happy to see you. All the tourists love to give you a wave and what have you. In virtually any other scenario, when you're driving around in most forces or London, people are more likely to, shout abuse at you or stick their fingers up than wave, But for some reason, when everyone sees a police boat on the river, particularly the tourists, they love to give you a wave. So it's actually quite a pleasant environment. And even though I worked on there in total for sort of 10 years, I always felt it was a privileged role. I really, really enjoyed it. Very challenging at times for sure. But, even, as I say, sort of 10 years in, I can remember sort of helming a boat, steering a boat effectively underneath, Tower Bridge and London Bridge and the big places like that, and thinking, wow, I'm getting paid for this. I love boats, and sometimes, not very often, but it would be, sunny and you'd have a lovely day. Some of the boats are equipped with fly bridges, which means that you can sit on top of the boat and steer from the top of the boat, although we did find that there was only about 3 days a year you could actually use it, because it was either too hot or too cold or too rainy, etc. But very, very privileged role, and lots of other cops would meet you from various jobs, that are on uniform patrol, and say, wow, you're so lucky, you've got an amazing job. And that is true, but I always said to them, well, it's not exclusive. I didn't get sort of some special buy-in to this. Anyone within the police can apply for this role. You have to be a cop first. You can't just apply for the Marine unit straight away from not being a cop at all. Once you're in the police, in the Met, you can then transfer across. But you have to put the effort in. You have to do the legwork, as it were, do the background, and get accepted onto the unit, and then get through all the training and pass, because a lot of people go through that training and don't actually pass, don't come to the standard. So it's within everyone's reach. I wasn't unique at all, and certainly when the people would moan, from the uniform response, oh, well, you've got an amazing job, you're so lucky. So, well, they didn't come and knock at my door and say, do you fancy this job? I had to go looking for it. So anyway, moving on as you do. Patrolling was a massive part of the day. You'd go down in the morning, all the night, because they're 24 hours a day, depending on what shift you were on. And you would firstly check over the boat, obviously. You'd have a chat with the previous crew and make sure there was no issues with the boat. And then you would probably check, things like you would on your car if you're going on a long journey. Check your oil and your water, make sure there's enough fuel in, fuel up the boat if it needed it. They were big tanks, so they would hold hundreds of litres of diesel, and a lot of the time you're at very slow speed. So actually, the fuel could last for several days or even a week or more. Alternatively, if you had a very fast job where you're doing, an hour's run in each direction flat out, then, you could do a tank in a day. So you just needed to keep on top of that. And all the different boats had their own little kind of idiosyncrasies. There was certain boats that were faster, some were slower, some handled better, some would particularly like to turn one way and not the other. Just those little things, I suppose, like a car or anything really, you're just getting used to and figuring out, what boat did what and how they handled really. So you would be out on patrol. Obviously, it'd be 3 of you on a boat. That was the general crew. And you would be given sort of patrol areas, and you were either generally in town in the central area, so you'd be heading up towards Westminster and patrolling along there. And you could go a very long way up. You could go as far up as Richmond without getting in too much difficulty. The river does start to become quite shallow there. Or you could go right down to the QE2 bridge and onto the Kent border, really. So you had a massive area to play with. And certainly if there'd been particular issues in certain areas, we would target those areas. But as a rule, it would generally be down to the boat crew for that day to decide where they wanted to go and, more importantly, where they wanted to stop. I won't say that we didn't know where all the ice cream shops were and the coffee shops. It's a bit of a cliche. I don't think they had donut shops specifically, but certainly we knew where all those sort of places were, because you're out there every day, and like I say, the boat has, a toilet on the board, or heads, because it's a boat. And cooking facilities, you had everything on board you could need for an extended stay. So and sometimes we did, there were occasions where we'd have to stay on the boat for 24, maybe 48 hours. I've stayed on boats depending on what the role was, particularly if you're a long way from the base, because it just wasn't practical to do 12 hours journey to come back when you might as well just stay overnight. And invariably you'd have a bit of notice of that, so you'd have a sort of overnight bag with you, but not always, so sometimes you would stay on duty for a very long time. Now, I'd say the vast majority of the work is made up with SAR calls, so search and rescue calls. Now, they're coordinated by the Coast Guard, so along the Thames River you have several lifeboat stations as well, which are on 24 hours a day, and unusually some of those, and generally in the UK, the lifeboat, which is dotted all around the coast, and covers all the sort of the sea and inland areas of the UK, they're volunteers. They don't get paid. They do it, and they have a pager, and the beep goes off, and off they go running to their boat to go and sort of commence a rescue. But unusually along the river, and there probably is other places as well, some of those people are in paid positions, so they're actually paid to be lifeboat crew. Particularly, I think that the skippers and the engineers and people like that. So you get to know them quite well. There's quite a few bases. They have some really, really good boats along the river. Unusual boats as well that are specifically adapted for the river, particularly for dragging people out of the river onto the boats. They're quite low in places and particularly wide and beamy. They generally have jet engines as well, and I don't mean like you'd find in a fighter pilot or a fighter aircraft. I mean, they spit out water jets at the back, because not only does it make them very, very manoeuvrable, but it also means there's no propellers to chop anyone's legs up. If you're coming alongside a casualty in the water, the last thing you want to do is hit them with your propeller. Now, the police boats, the vast majority had propellers, so it was something we were very, very aware of. And to my knowledge, I don't think we've ever hit anyone, with our props or anything, because, as I say, the skippers of the boat on the day would be supremely aware of that fact, So what would happen is a call would come in, and obviously nowadays calls generally would come from mobile phones, people on bridges that are walking across, might be a tourist, might be a commuter, whoever, and they see someone either fall into the river or more often than not, they might jump in the river. Lots of people choose the river as a way of committing suicide, or certainly attempting to commit suicide, because hopefully, a lot of them are rescued. But the sad fact is there's something like 50 bodies a year recovered by the Marine Unit from the river, not solely by the Marine Unit, because sometimes it was the lifeboat, it might be the Coast Guard, it could be the Port of London Authority. One of the boats on the river, would either recover the body or would call the police to come along and recover the body. And that's quite difficult, as you can imagine, because they are in varying states of decomposition. Some are very fresh, the sad ones are the ones you just missed literally by 10 minutes, something like that. But others, could be gone for weeks, because don't forget, once they go below the surface, there's so many snagging points on the river. You've got so many different pontoons and anchors and chains and ropes and what have you spread around on the bottom of the Thames going back, hundreds of years. There's a lot of snag points. So occasionally we'd never find a body at all. We would know that someone had gone in, but we would never ever actually find their body because they might permanently be snagged and never ever come up. That was quite unusual though, because generally the tide, as I think I said before, could run up to 6 knots, in either direction, and generally the tides would run in one direction so that all the water would rush into London for approximately 6 hours. Starts off slow and sort of peaks in the middle at about the 3-hour point, maybe up to 6 knots on a spring tide. And then after 6 hours, you have a period of about an hour, but probably more like 45 minutes where it'd be slack water. So the water wouldn't actually be going in or out. It would just be doing nothing. And then sure enough, the tide would turn and then all the water would rush back out again. Same thing, starts off slow, builds up and peaks at kind of the 3-hour point in the middle of the tide. So that obviously would have a very much a dislodging effect for any bodies that were in the river. But not always, as I say, we sometimes never found some people. And generally when a body goes in the water, initially they will sink, but then after time they will come up. Now that time and how long it takes for them to come up is controlled generally by the water temperature. So for example, if someone went into the water in the winter when the water is a lot colder, and that water temperature might get down to say 5 degrees, for example, in the river, you might expect it anything up to say 3 weeks before that body surfaces, because what happens is as the decomposition process happens, gases fill the body, and actually eventually the body bloats up to the point that it will be buoyant and it will float to the surface. And in the winter, let's say, that can take 3 weeks-ish. You couldn't sort of set your clock by it, but that's a guide. Whereas in the summer, when the water temperature was warmer, you might find that the water temperature might get up to say 10 degrees or something, and sometimes a body would be up within a week. Now, once it had come to the surface and was bloated and was full of gas, you had a finite time, and this isn't an exact science, to basically recover that body while it was floating on the surface. If you missed your opportunity and eventually those gases go, and I'll get really graphic here, unfortunately, unfortunately the bodies can start to come apart and split, and when those gases escape, the body then sinks again. Well, once it's sunk for that second time, it's never coming up again. So if that window is missed where the body is not found for that period while it's on the surface floating, once it goes down again, that's it won't come up. So the only way you're now recovering that body is with a dive team. And in the river itself, the main river Thames, that's incredibly difficult, and we're going to talk about that in detail in future episodes. Body recovery, very sad. If they're on the surface, invariably you had various ways of actually retrieving them. You come alongside them and you would use a boat hook perhaps to snag their clothing, or you might have sometimes like a large sort of cargo net that you basically wrap around them, and then you'd secure them to the side of the boat. And then you would very slowly drive back to the base with the body sort of strapped to the side of the boat. Generally that body would be in the water, so you wouldn't be able to tell what it was. If you were going past on a passenger vessel, it wasn't like you would see a body being dragged along the side of the boat. You'd just see some sort of net on the side and the body would be below the surface. But the difficulty there was that if that body had been in the water for a period of time, maybe it could be a month or something, then the flow of water over it may assist in breaking it up on the way back. So certainly, unfortunately, when bodies are recovered and have been in the water a long time, by the time you get back to the base, I think it's fair to say you've probably got less body than you started with. But there's just no other way of doing it. It's physically impossible to recover them, because if you try and drag them out of the water, I'm afraid, like something out of a horror film, bits come off in your hand, so you end up not actually getting them not actually getting hold of them and breaking them up, I'm afraid. So they come back on the sort of cargo net that's secured to the side of the boat. And then when you got back to the base at Wapping, there's actually a lift, an electric sort of winch on the side, on a crane on the side of the pontoon. You'd bring your boat alongside and you would attach that to the crane, and then you'd be able to lift your cargo net with your body in, up out of the boat or from beside the boat, Now, all the time this is happening, you have passenger vessels and tourist vessels continuing to sort of plough past the base at Wapping. So obviously you would try and be sensitive and subtle, but sometimes you just couldn't help. And the looks on people's faces when they're hearing on their sort of tourist commentary, and here we have on the right, this is the Marine Policing Unit at Wapping, and they've been going a good few hundred years, and oh, look at their shiny boats. And everyone brings their camera up or their phone up to take a photo. And of course, they don't realise that here we are manhandling a very decomposed body. So that left to a few shocked faces, I'm afraid, and there must be some terrible photos out there when people zoom in. But what would happen was we had a sort of set up on the pontoon there that was a small shed with an electric sort of sliding door at the front, and you would raise that up, and within that room was I can only describe it as a large soap dish, really. It's a stainless steel, big body size sort of soap dish with wheels on it, and you would take the brakes off and slide it over to underneath your net, your cargo net that contains your body. And you would manoeuvre the body into that dish, lower it on the crane, and then once it was within the dish, you'd be able to then push that soap dish back into this room and close the door. So now you could work on the body without being seen, by the passing vessels. But as I say, unfortunately, to get to that point, chances are they have seen you sort of working on that person. So once they're within that room and the door is closed, what you have to do is almost certainly take their clothes off. That's very difficult to do, particularly, as I say, depending on their state of decomposition. I mean, it's probably one of the most unpleasant tasks on the Marine unit, but then you have to come into that role with your eyes open. I don't think at that point it's going to be a shock to you that, I've got to handle bodies and I've got to undress them. You must have been sort of living in a cave if you came onto the Marine unit and didn't think that wasn't going to be your role, So really unpleasant, but has to be done. And the reason you do that is, firstly, you're looking to search the body, search, the pockets of the clothes that come off them, but you're also particularly looking for identification on that body. So tattoos and scars and, maybe digits missing, fingers missing, toes missing, anything really that's an identifying feature, because on a lot of occasions, we would have no clue who these people were. So you'd have the local sort of coroner's officer come down, and maybe a cop from one of the local stations would come down with their sort of list of missing people and try and figure out just who this person was. And that's a very difficult role. You can do DNA, although it's harder once they've been in water. But the other thing is, of course, the UK has a massive DNA database. I think there's something like 6 million people on it. But if that person has never had any involvement with the police throughout their life, they may not be on the DNA database. So that's not absolutely conclusive that you're going to identify who that person is. And then from there, you would call once they're stripped and you've made a note, you filled out your form, you've recovered the clothing, you've checked for any sort of wallet or passport or driving license or anything like that, the obvious stuff. You've made a note of all the tattoos and scars, etc. You would call the local undertakers, who would come down with their trolley down onto the pontoon and actually place that body in the body bag, and then they'd be recovered back up and taken to the local undertakers or whoever was going to deal with it, if you did know. So yeah, pretty unpleasant task, but obviously had to be done. One of the worst, in living memory, one of the worst occasions they've had on the river was something called the Marchioness disaster in 1989. Now, the Marchioness was a passenger boat, and in that year, she was travelling downriver, and there was also a dredger travelling downriver in the same direction as her called the Bow Bell. Now, I don't think it's actually clear entirely what happened, but basically the Bow Bell, the dredger, much larger than the Marchioness, ended up hitting the Marchioness twice because I think of the angles they were at. And the Marchioness sunk within 30 seconds of being hit. Now, bearing in mind this was the early hours of the morning, so obviously completely dark. I can't remember what time of year it was. I think it was September, so it was probably reasonably chilly at that point. But a lot of people died. 51 people died as a result of that from the Marchioness. And a number of bodies, I think it was something like 24 bodies were recovered from within the actual vessel itself, that's how quickly it went down. People just couldn't get out in time. And obviously there was a big, investigation afterwards to see what had happened and sort of who was at fault, if anybody. I don't think it ever actually came to any full conclusions, but one of the things that's changed is all the commercial vessels now post a lookout, a physical person to stand on the bow of all the vessels at the front of the boats to basically, have communications with the skipper who is steering that ship to tell them, if anything's in front of them. And I would say it has tightened up a lot, in terms of the river. But the other thing that came out of it was, I think they identified that lots of people had gone into the water and had actually managed to not sort of sink with the vessel. So they were now in the river, multiple people in the river. I think there was 130 on the boat in total. But once they were in the river, this cold river, and let's face it, the Thames is cold any time of the year, even in August when it's 30 degrees air temperature. You'd be lucky if you had 7 or 8 degrees in the river, maybe 10 degrees. That is not warm water by any respect. And you've got really limited time, maybe 20 minutes or something, survival rate in that sort of water. And now there's lots of variables, so that's not exact, but just to give you a guide. So what you now see on the river is lots and lots of chains slung under the bridges and all along the river walls, that are looped along those locations because people went into the water and then couldn't keep afloat, or if they could initially keep afloat, as they got cold and presumably, their limbs started to slow down, they just didn't have the opportunity to keep afloat and to stay above the water. So my understanding is a few died like that. So if you walk along the river and look under the bridge, you'll see lots and lots of chains slung under those locations so that people, if they went into the water, can hang on to those chains. And don't forget, those chains have to be at different levels because the rise and fall of the water of the tide is substantial. It can be kind of 3, maybe 5 meters of height on the water going up and down. So those chains, it's no good putting them at one level because they'll be under the water at one point, or they'll be 20 feet above your head if you're in the water. So lots of chains slung, and that's a number of times I've certainly found people hanging on to those chains. So they do their job. They're very valuable. So we talk about some specific instances now. One of the first calls I had, which was slightly bizarre, was a search and rescue call, a SAR call. And we were at the base at the time at Wapping, and it was some way up past Westminster. So that is a fast run. Now, bearing in mind that the speed limit for other boats on the river is 12 knots, so probably about 15 miles an hour. And to be honest with you, even that would be quite quick for a lot of boats on the river. But these police boats we had could do 45 knots, and could maybe do, 50 odd miles an hour, 52 miles an hour, something like that. So you would put your blue lights and sirens on. It's quite exciting. And you would jump in your boat. And then we were flat out up to this call where someone had been reported as jumping into the river with a suitcase. So we went flying up. Now on the way, if you see the Thames on pretty much any day, but particularly in the summer, of which it now was, there is a lot of boats on the river. You've got, your sort of pleasure cruisers, because anyone can go on the river. Then you've got, lots of passenger trips, the tourist trips back and forward, loads of those of varying sizes and shapes at different speeds. And then you have, a lot of commercial traffic. So you have dredgers and you have a lot of rubbish barges that sometimes towed down kind of 3 abreast. So you've got these huge barges that are lashed together, so they're now 3 barges wide, which makes them huge, and this is all mixed in with this 6-knot tide. There's water rushing in or rushing out of the river. It makes for quite an exciting environment, and when you're trying to thread your way through, generally it's the opposite side to how we drive on the road in the UK. Boats generally go on the right hand side of the river, so more how you would see it abroad. And that takes a bit of getting used to, but generally you would try and stay on the right, but it wasn't always possible because you would literally have to thread your way through at 45 knots on blues and twos, in this boat to get up to your location. So it certainly made it quite exciting. We used to get a lot of complaints, particularly from the passenger boats, saying that we'd been going too fast and that you were responsible for your own wash. So as you go along and the boat has, a wake out the back that sort of travels out and eventually goes to either side of you, and will obviously hit any vessel that is either side of you as you pass them. Now, if you go past super slow, then there's hardly any wash that goes in. So not a problem. If you go through at sort of middling speed, maybe like 12, 15 knots, which I say technically 12 knots is the speed limit, then the police boats would put out a massive wash and, maybe like a 3-foot wave. Now, anyone who was not ready for it, it could definitely sort of, tip their boat over if it was a small one, or cause them real issues. And on the bigger sort of passenger vessels, we'd find at that sort of speed, you could easily knock all their, champagne glasses over or something. But what they didn't seem to realise was, and it was just, I think, optics, as they call it nowadays, but if you're going at 45 knots flat out in one of those boats, there's very, very little wake. But quite often we would have a lot of spurious claims coming in from various river users that we had smashed their champagne glasses and we owed them for, 100 glasses, or that one of their, passengers had fallen over and hurt themselves, and there was a claim. And so we did have a bit of that. Generally, if you went past fast, although it looked bad and people assume that's the police rushing around for no reason, ultimately you are heading to a call to try and save someone's life. So it's about as important as it gets. But yeah, go past fast, you have very little effect other than how it looks. Go past at sort of 12 knots and you put out a huge wash, and for sure can cause damage and cause issues. So it's something to be aware of anyway. So we get up to this location, and you'd have maybe 1 or 2 lifeboats that have come out as well. You might have a Coast Guard vessel. Certainly nearby sort of passenger boats may assist you. Because they'd all hear it on the radio. It would have gone out as a mayday possibly on the radio, or certainly be put out by the Coast Guard on channel 16, which is like the emergency channel on VHF on a marine radio. So you could have several boats involved, and it was down to the Coast Guard to coordinate those boats. So if somebody jumped in off a bridge, for example, you would need to put someone, and it might be a lifeboat or it might be us, you just sort of slot into whatever role, was closest to you. You would have one boat that would sit uptide of the bridge in case they came that way, unlikely as it was against the tide. You would have 1 or 2 boats that would sit downtide, so if you're waiting for someone to jump off the bridge, because a lot of the time we arrived and they hadn't actually jumped, they were just threatening to jump. So you'd have a couple of boats downtide on the basis that if they jumped in the water, they would get washed down to you. And you would probably have a 3rd boat that might be searching the foreshore, because there's a chance that if it was low tide and quite shallow, they might have very quickly got into sort of standing depth and been able to help themselves and actually get off the beach. But you have to remember, a lot of these people wanted to commit suicide. I've had people kind of holding their breath and ducking their head under when I've tried to pass them a rope, or I've had boat hooks where I've tried to snag their clothing when they've been in the water and they physically push me away, because they just don't want to be saved. They're very sad, and quite hard to deal with. But on this occasion, this guy had jumped in with this suitcase, and which was a bit unusual. We assumed, he had his sort of, life's belongings or something, or maybe some important paperwork. But we searched for him for maybe half an hour and couldn't find anything at all. And then eventually we saw something floating on the surface, and went over and saw that it was a suitcase, and that was all that was left, a suitcase, or so we thought, because when we went over and actually recovered the suitcase, we realised that he was attached to it. He'd handcuffed himself to the suitcase and then to his wrist. I'm not really sure what the thinking was there, to be honest with you, because the suitcase wasn't full of important papers. It just had books in it. It looks like he'd bought a few books, and I think he thought the books in the suitcase would weigh him down and take him under the water. But the reality was there was air in the suitcase, and everything that was in that suitcase actually helped him float, although ultimately he died underneath it, attached by a handcuff to it. So I say, I think he thought that it would take him down, and he wouldn't have a choice of changing his mind. But the reality is, it floated and actually enabled us to find the suitcase, and ultimately him, because he was attached beneath it. So that was my very first body recovery from the river, and that came, I think, on about my 2nd day. And it was very random. You could have, you might have no calls for 3 or 4 days. You could go literally 3 or 4 days without a call, and then you could have 3 jumpers from bridges and a body recovery in 1 day. It was just very, very random. You never knew what you were going to be dealing with, which of course is the interesting part of police work. But hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of what that marine policing unit role is. There is a lot more to it as well, and we'll go on to discuss that in future episodes. But we'll call that it for now. We're just going up to half an hour, so I hope you've enjoyed that and found it interesting. Keep coming back for more, please. Tell anyone you think might be interested, and keep the downloads coming. As I say, by all means, pop onto YouTube, leave some comments or ask a question if you want, and I'll see if I can assist. Okay, take it easy. Speak soon. Cheers. Bye.